The chapter titles of William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies reveal surprisingly much of the meaning of the novel. To get started, here are the 12 titles, each illustrated with a short clip from Harry Hook's 1990 movie.
This is a present for the monster.
The structure of each title is the same. Each one contains two main words, first an action or interpretation, then an object used or interpreted. Some of the actions make constructive, material use of the object. The shell for calling the boys together, the mountain for lighting the signal fire, the beach for building the huts, the boys' faces for painting them, the rock for turning it into a castle. Where the interpretations only exist in the boys' minds, the objects merely serve for projection. The sea and the air as the home of the beast, the forest and the darkness of night as the primary location and time of the shadows in the boys' minds. The topics of the titles exhibit a peculiar antisymmetry. The topics of the first 6 chapter titles reappear, in reverse order and changed form, in the last 6 titles. Internal communication turns from the welcoming sound of the shell in chapter 1 to the deadly cry of the hunters in chapter 12. Fire turns from a means of external communication, from a plea for help in chapter 2, to a weapon of war in chapter 12. The homely shelters of chapter 3 are replaced by the oppressive castle of chapter 11. The works of mercy in chapter 3, housing, feeding, admonishing, comforting, are replaced by the sin of robbery in chapter 10. Hiding one's own self behind dazzle paint in chapter 4 turns into violence, into killing of animals right away, and into killing of humans in chapter 9. In chapter 5, Jack scorns boys scared by the beast as crybabies. In chapter 8, he uses that very fear to sway his own followers. In chapter 6, Ralph knows his own weakness and feels unable to oppose the beast of the air. In chapter 7, he falls into shadow himself, experiencing violent ecstasy both in real hunting of a wild boar and in a mock hunt. In chapters 1 to 4, all the actions mentioned in the titles are rational and useful. Calling everyone together, lighting a signal fire, building shelters, and to a certain extent even hunting pigs. A purely vegetarian diet is harder for children than for grown-ups. For the first 3 chapters, the objects mentioned in the titles are the parts of nature the boys use: the shell, the mountain, the beach. So the logical title for chapter 4 would have been Pigs in the Forest. Instead, for the first time, both the action and the object refer to the children themselves. What does that mean? Most strikingly, the part of nature used, and necessarily used more destructively than in the first 3 cases, is not even mentioned in the title: Pigs in the Forest. The boys hardly respect the pigs. They do not regard them as living beings they are forced to reluctantly kill to survive. Instead, they focus on themselves, on their own adventure, cunning, strength, even heroism. They almost regard the pigs as enemies. Jack explicitly says about his dazzle paint, "like in war." That focus on himself comes with a considerable loss of rationality. Preparing the hunt, he disregards everything else, even his own freely made promise to take care of the signal fire. The second peculiar aspect of the title of chapter 4 is that it actually contains 2 titles: Painted Faces and Long Hair. Painted Faces is Jack's perspective. Long Hair is Ralph's perspective. Paying attention to many details of the text, you will find that the unchecked growth of the hair is a symbol for Ralph's difficulties in turning intelligent analysis into rational and effective action. Ralph, overburdened with the responsibility for a whole island of even younger children, hovers between reverie, fooling around, and thoughtfulness. He is partly aware of his own imperfection, partly accepts it, and consciously tries to mature. The incomplete success of his struggles is related to the symbol of his growing hair. Jack is facing an equally impossible challenge. As a 12-year-old boy, he is much too young to become a leader of hunters. In contrast to Ralph's thoughtfulness and doubts, he deals with the excessive pressure by forcefully and violently asserting himself. He feels compelled to be perfect right now, and certainly wants others to see him that way. So long before the cry of the hunters, the growing rift between Jack and Ralph is stressed in the title of chapter 4. Not a rift between good and evil, but between 2 kinds of strongly developing, but still imperfect self-consciousnesses. In chapters 5 to 8, all the interpretations mentioned in the titles are irrational, driven by fears without substance. In the first 3, these fears are projected onto material parts of nature: the sea, the air, and the forest, while the darkness occurring in the title of chapter 8 is immaterial. Superficially, it might be the darkness of night, since that's indeed where the boys' fears first arose. But actually, the idol they set up personifies their own inner beastliness rather than the darkness of night. So here, for the first time, both the object and the interpretation are immaterial. And just like in chapter 4, the title of chapter 8 fully refers to the boys themselves, no longer to any part of nature. Like in chapters 1 to 3, the actions in chapters 5 to 7 still retain a certain amount of rationality, even if to a lesser degree. It does make sense to investigate and debunk reports about beasts, though that degrades into absurd talk about ghosts and into a frenzy at the end of chapter 5. Once the beast was supposedly seen, it does in part make sense to search for it, to find out what and where it is, even though it's completely unclear what to do in case of actually finding it. Like in chapter 4, once the last link to anything specific in nature is sewered in the title of chapter 8, rationality vastly deteriorates. It certainly makes no sense whatsoever to sacrifice to a beast, and even less so without having the slightest idea what that actually is. That can only be a way to irrationally pacify one's own mind, and to emotionally control the minds of others, without solving any real-world problem. In chapters 9 to 12, we see the familiar pattern again. 3 material objects, the corpse of the parachutist, Piggy's glasses, and Jack's rock. Then again the boys themselves at the end, the hunters. That doesn't bode well after all that was said so far. The obvious interpretation of A View to a Death is that the acting person is Simon when he finds the dead man on the mountain top. Curiously, he's not at all the first one to see a death, not even this particular death. Sam, Eric, Jack, Ralph, and Roger have all seen the same before, but they fled in terror, so to them it was merely a beast from air and shadows among the trees. What makes the difference is that Simon comes deliberately by the light of day and stays on site until he understands. That is what Golding qualifies as viewing, making sure to actually understand and not letting oneself be fooled by fear or by incomplete or misleading impressions. By the way, the dead man on the mountain isn't Simon's first view to a death. In chapter 8 he already saw the pig's death, and in his confrontation with the Lord of the Flies he saw his own death. We'll come back to that shortly. No doubt chapter 9 has the most unusual and most interesting title of all chapters. There is yet another view to a death in chapter 9. The other boys' view on Simon's death while they are killing him. Ralph is the first one to think about it the next morning, but all the others follow suit. Piggy, Sam and Eric, Jack, Stanley, Maurice, and all the other hunters. Those views to a death, and how people deal with them, are among the central topics of the book. How craziness and violence arise from unchecked fear, how fear gets exploited for power, and how people deal with the memory of guilt by subterfuge, denial, despair, superstition, and an almost Orwellian doublethink that both does and does not remember the guilt at the same time. In his confrontation with the Lord of the Flies, Simon understands some of this, so his is truly a view to a death. But he doesn't understand enough of it such that he could explain it to the others, not even by the light of day, and if they would be willing to listen. Caution and planning are not among his strengths. Or he might have slept in the forest and delayed his report about the parachutists until he could speak to Ralph in private by the light of day, saving his life and probably Piggy's. For Simon, viewing the mode of his own death is insufficient to prevent it. Helping others is too deeply ingrained in his character to avoid the foolish attempt of communicating the breaking news at the worst possible instant. You might think, and besides, who would have expected that kind of a manslaughter? But remember that Simon actually does expect it, and all the same it is not surprising that he is unable to escape from it. The obvious perspective for chapter 10 is Piggy's. He was robbed of his glasses, and hence both of his sight and of his last slim chance to keep the vital signal fire going. Consequently, he decides to use diplomacy and justice, both symbolized by the shell, to get back his sight and to restore hope for all by relighting the fire. However, inverting the title, the glasses and the shell, allows to switch to Jack's perspective. For him, the shell, symbolizing Ralph's lot, is a much bigger problem than the beast. Not only because with Piggy's glasses, they are still the keepers of the fire, while he was never able to go begging anybody for anything. Even more because living on their own, they limit his personal power, a state of affairs he feels unable to accept. So he decides to take the glasses by force, and with them the fire, and to deprive the others of their perception, of their means of communication, and of their livelihood. The obvious perspective for chapter 11 is Jack's. He sees the rock and turns it into his castle, uniting his followers by hammering into them the intention to fend off all intruders. The others, that is, Ralph and Piggy, with at least as much determination as the beast. Here, it is even less obvious than with respect to chapter 10 that the title can be inverted. Rock the castle. That's Piggy's perspective. To him, the castle only matters because it's Jack's lair. The military virtues of the rock mean nothing to Piggy. He is not a warrior. His intention is to rock the castle until his glasses and a new signal fire fall out. And that's what he does. He agitates the tribe until they are moved to action. Unfortunately, neither to insight or reason, nor to justice or even compromise, but to fury and violence, ultimately to murder and to Piggy's own death. Chapter 12 is narrated entirely from Ralph's perspective, so the logical chapter title would have been Flight from the Hunters. From Ralph's perspective, the hunters are the object he has to deal with, but he no longer has any options for action. Hiding and flight are not only hopeless, but so irrelevant they don't even appear in the chapter title, even though almost nothing else happens in the whole chapter except hiding and flight. Again, inversion works here too. From Jack's perspective, nothing's given beforehand. The acting people, the hunters, the object of the hunt, Ralph, and the symbolic action, the cry, are all purely culturally determined and determined by him. There is no longer any dependency on nature or on anything else. Superficially, he is in complete control of the situation, fully in power. Of course, with his giant wildfire devastating the island, burning the fruit trees and the pigs, he also dooms himself and his tribe. But he is unable to see that. He is so far gone that he only thinks of power, of control over other human beings, no longer about the actual necessities of life. A crucial element of the chapter titles is reflexivity. Every fourth chapter title doesn't have an object, but just a subject acting on itself. In chapter 4, Jack paints his own face. In chapter 8, Jack sets up the Lord of the Flies as an idol of their own inner darkness. In chapter 12, the hunters cry. In each case, Jack is the main actor. In each case, he establishes a new cultural norm. Hide your natural identity. Live in fear and violence. Kill the others. In each case, killing is involved, first for food, then for ritual, and finally manhunt for pure power. Each of these 3 chapters marks the climax of a group of 3 chapters with similar titles and content. The attempt to rationally use what they find on the island in chapters 1 to 3 is derailed by the painted hunting in chapter 4. The delusions projected onto nature in chapters 5 to 7 culminate in the bloody cult of the beast in chapter 8. The crimes of the final third of the book, manslaughter in the heat of passion in chapter 9, premeditated robbery in chapter 10, murder in chapter 11, prepare for the collective manhunt in chapter 12. As long as there is some external point of reference, some object acted on or considered, there is in principle still a chance for reason to take effect. When that is removed in chapters 4, 8, and 12, new cultural norms can be made up to support no matter what. For chapters 1 to 3 and 5 to 8, each title has one single interpretation of common significance for all the children. For chapter 4, the title is twofold, and for chapters 9 to 12, each title can be read in two opposite ways, indicating the growing rift in the group. In chapter 4, the rift opens with diverging character development that isn't bridged by empathy and communication. In chapter 9, delusion and violence are contrasted to insight and wisdom. In chapters 10 and 11, force opposes reason and striving for power defeats striving for the common good. In chapter 12, that results in terminal dehumanization. This escalation path may well be among the chief insights Golding intended to unfold. Even at this point, analysis of the titles is not complete. For example, you could ask which characters are performing the action mentioned in each title, which will among others provide some first hints regarding the pivotal importance of the little ones in the development of the plot. But that would be a subject for a separate essay. Or you could ask who profits from each action and who suffers from it. Obviously, even a complete analysis of 24 words and chapter titles could not replace the analysis of a whole book. And you will have noticed that I used lots of interpretations derived from the rest of the text to decipher the titles. Some central subjects are not mentioned in the titles at all. In particular, Golding expresses the fatal lack of some human emotions and behaviors by subtly alluding to them in various places of the text without ever discussing them explicitly. In particular, this applies to love and to tenderness, two topics that are critical to understanding the novel. Obviously, the chapter titles can hardly provide any hint to these hidden topics, but that would be a subject for yet another separate essay. However, the titles do provide a list of many topics Golding considered important. Communication, cooperation and mercy versus aggression, fear and hate, the triangle of naturalness, unscrupulousness and wisdom, empathy and reason versus manipulation and superstition. Now you are all set to look deeper into these topics beyond what the titles reveal.